I have followed Middle East conflicts for years, and I have never seen anything quite like what happened this week, because when headlines announced an incident linked to Kuwait Airport, most people immediately focused on the explosion and the visible damage and the political reactions that followed. But what very few analysts paused to notice was something far deeper moving underneath the surface, something that does not appear in the first wave of breaking news, something that only becomes visible when you step back and look at the pattern instead of the moment. And the real story is not just the airport. The real story is what this moment reveals about the next phase of Iran, 2026. And if that sounds like an overstatement, then consider the stakes for a second, because nearly 1/3 of global seaborne oil still moves through a single choke point, the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow corridor that quietly holds the global economy together, where even a small disruption does not stay local, it ripples outward into fuel prices, shipping costs, insurance premiums, inflation, and eventually into the daily cost of living thousands of miles away in places that may not even realize they are connected to it. And this is why this is not just a regional dispute. This is economic pressure. This is strategic signaling. And this is a live test of deterrence. Because for months, tensions between Washington and Tehran have been building in slow, visible layers. Military deployments increased, naval patrols became more frequent, surveillance expanded across the Gulf airspace and maritime corridors. Alliances in the region quietly shifted, not through dramatic announcements, but through subtle repositioning. And the language from both sides hardened not overnight, but gradually, until it became clear that both sides were no longer speaking in diplomatic softness, but in calculated warning tones. And then the incident happened, and suddenly the question changed from what happened to why now, and why this target, and why at this exact moment. Because in regional security analysis, timing often carries more meaning than the impact itself. And when you look at the 72 hours before the event, a different picture begins to form, not focused on destruction, but focused on signaling and perception. Because in the Gulf, nothing is usually random. Every move is designed to be observed and interpreted by multiple audiences. The same time, adversaries, allies, markets, shipping operators, energy traders, and even internal decision-making structures within states. And in this case, the Kuwait-linked incident created a reaction, not only because of what was physically affected, but because of what it symbolized about reach, capability, and vulnerability at a moment when deterrence frameworks were already under strain. And the shift we are seeing is not only physical damage, it is psychological, because when boundaries begin to feel less predictable, every actor in the region starts recalculating risk in real time, and that recalculation does not wait for official statements. It begins instantly in military rooms and trading floors, in embassy briefings, and in naval command centers. And this is where Iran 2026 becomes important, because Iranian strategy over the past years has steadily leaned toward asymmetric pressure rather than direct confrontation, focusing on drones, missile systems, fast attack platforms, and distributed networks, not to match conventional U.S. military power, but to bypass it entirely and apply pressure where it creates the highest strategic sensitivity, especially around maritime choke points, energy corridors, and critical infrastructure nodes. And that matters because the Gulf is one of the most sensitive regions in the world when it comes to disruption. Even a small incident near a shipping lane can trigger insurance spikes, rerouting decisions, convoy adjustments, and immediate volatility in global energy markets. And this is why Kuwait is not just a geographic reference in this story. It becomes part of a wider signaling ecosystem where military analysts often emphasize that modern conflict is not only about damage, but about visibility, perception, and message transmission. And in that sense, the Kuwait-linked incident appears less like a standalone strike and more like a demonstration of reach, credibility, and operational awareness. And in deterrence theory, credibility is everything, because deterrence only works when both sides believe consequences are not theoretical but real, immediate, and enforceable. And the moment that belief weakens even slightly, the risk of escalation begins to rise quietly, even without a formal decision for escalation. And now add another layer to this already unstable environment, a region that is currently undergoing strategic uncertainty, where multiple Middle Eastern states are adjusting their security posture simultaneously, creating what some analysts describe as a fluid influence environment, not because governments are collapsing, but because the balance of certainty is shifting. And in such environments, even small events can produce oversized reactions, especially when they intersect with contested maritime routes, energy supply chains, and critical infrastructure corridors. and there is also growing discussion among analysts about internal decision-making dynamics within Iran, including the possibility of competing strategic voices within advisory structures, shaping timing, operational choices, and response calibration, and whether or not every detail of that interpretation is fully accurate. The important point is perception, because perception of unpredictability alone is enough to alter deterrence calculations and increase the probability of misjudgment, and markets understand this dynamic even faster than governments, because markets do not wait for confirmation. They react to risk, and risk spreads instantly through oil pricing, shipping insurance, freight costs, and currency expectations. And that is why the Strait of Hormuz remains at the center of every major escalation discussion in global geopolitics, because it is not just geography, it is leverage, and history also gives us context, because past Gulf tensions repeatedly followed a familiar pattern where localized incidents slowly escalated into wider cycles of response and counter-response, where each action created justification for the next, and escalation did not always begin with intent, but often began with interpretation, misreading, and assumption. And this is the critical point, because conflicts rarely begin in a single moment. They develop through perception and interpretation, and through assumptions about red lines and intentions, and the Kuwait incident fits into this broader historical pattern, not necessarily because of its scale, but because of how it is interpreted, and perception often drives early-stage decisions more than verified facts, because leaders respond in real time to what they believe is unfolding, not only to what is confirmed, and those reactions then shape deployments, posture, and strategic planning. And once that momentum begins, it becomes increasingly difficult to reverse. And if we extend the timeline forward, the concern is not limited to one incident, but to repetition, because if similar events continue near maritime infrastructure, energy corridors, or shipping routes, the cumulative effect could slowly reshape economic stability far beyond the region, affecting fuel prices, transport systems, supply chains, industrial production costs, and eventually consumer inflation across multiple economies. And that is why global attention is so high right now, because the question is no longer only about what happened, it is about trajectory. Whether this represents temporary escalation or the early formation of a longer structural shift in regional geopolitics. And some analysts believe deterrence will still hold, because both sides fully understand the consequences of direct confrontation, while others warn that repeated pressure increases the probability of strategic miscalculation over time, especially in environments where signals are ambiguous. And there is also a third scenario emerging in strategic discussions, and it is not full-scale war, and it is not stable peace, but a prolonged phase of managed tension where maritime pressure, economic signaling, and indirect confrontation become the default condition rather than the exception. And in that scenario, the region does not move toward resolution, but toward controlled instability that can persist for years, even decades, reshaping alliances, energy flows, military planning, and global economic expectations in slow, continuous waves. And now, if we zoom even deeper into this evolving structure, another layer becomes visible, and that is the psychological architecture of deterrence itself, because modern deterrence is not only built on military capability, but on belief systems and perception frameworks. And when those belief systems begin to weaken even slightly, the entire structure becomes unstable, not because power has changed, but because interpretation has changed. And this is where the Gulf becomes uniquely sensitive, because every actor involved is constantly reading signals, not in isolation, but in relation to historical memory and previous escalation cycles. And this creates a situation where even small operational events are amplified into strategic indicators, and those indicators then feed back into decision-making loops, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of caution, escalation, and counter-preparation. And in such an environment, ambiguity becomes both a weapon and a risk, because ambiguity allows strategic flexibility, but also increases the probability of miscalculation and misinterpretation. And this is why analysts often emphasize that the most dangerous phase in any geopolitical tension is not when war begins, but when signals become unclear enough that every side believes it is still acting defensively, while the other side interprets it as escalation. And that mismatch in perception avalobagat this paction, but this vitals ofardas exprakel so, is where crises are born. And when we apply this framework back onto the Kuwait-linked incident, it becomes less about physical damage and more about interpretive impact, because what matters is not only what happened, but how it is being read across different strategic communities, including military planners, intelligence analysts, energy markets, and diplomatic channels. And each of these systems processes the same event differently, creating multiple parallel narratives that do not always align, and that divergence is itself a source of instability because coordination becomes harder when perception is fragmented. And this fragmentation is amplified further by modern information ecosystems, where news spreads instantly, but verification lags behind, and in that gap between speed and certainty, speculation fills the space, and speculation becomes part of the strategic environment, whether intentionally or not. And when we combine all of these dimensions, military signaling, economic sensitivity, asymmetric warfare, psychological deterrence, information fragmentation, and historical repetition, the overall picture is not one of a single confrontation, but of a slowly evolving system where traditional rules of escalation are being replaced by continuous low-intensity signaling cycles. And that brings us back to the central question: did Iran cross a line in Kuwait, or are we actually witnessing the transformation of what that line even means? Because in systems like this, lines are not fixed boundaries. They are shifting constructs defined by perception, pressure, and response, or sometimes they only become visible in hindsight, after the system has already moved beyond them. And in the end, what happened near Kuwait Airport may either be remembered as a single isolated incident, or as the moment when a much larger geopolitical transformation quietly began to unfold. And right now, the world is watching carefully, waiting for the next move, while that next decision may already be performing somewhere out of sight in calculation rooms, briefing tables, naval command centers, intelligence coordination hubs, and strategic advisory circles under the name Nexa World Brief.